Hello, this is Mrs McTaggart here, and in this video, it's actually the second video on mental percentages. I'm looking at ones that are maybe found in two steps this time rather than just doing it in one direct division sum. They are still common percentages that is really good to know off by heart and see how we go. So let's just get straight into our little table that I always start with. So these are the common percentages. It's really handy to know as fractions. So 75% is obviously related to 25%. It's 3/4. So if you remember 25% is a quarter, this is 3/4, which is essentially you finding 25% and timesing it by 3. 66 and 2/3, we've talked about 33 and 1/3 before. This is just double it. So if you remember 33 and 1/3 is 1/3, this is double. And the clue's in the question as well. This is 2/3. So to do that, you're going to divide by 3 and then times by 2. Now 30% is 3/10 as a fraction. I don't always tend to talk about the fractions though. I tend to think of it as a multiple of 10, and I would tell you to get 10% and then times it by 3. 12.5% is a weird one. I don't always include this, but I thought I would since it's going on a video and I did a really able class this year. So 12.5% is just half of 25%. So it's actually 1/8. And a lot of people don't always do it by an eighth. They do it by getting 25% and then halving it. 5% is 1/20, so it depends how good you are at dividing by 20. But there is an easier way. This is just 10% and then half your answer. And then 2% is 1/50, but like, come on, who's going to divide by 50? So let's just take that back out, and I'm just going to leave 2% as 2 out of 100. And what you're going to do here is you're going to get 1% and you're going to times it by 2. Now, with your 30% and your 2%, the same method works if I gave you 40%, 60%, 70% and so on. Or if I gave you 3%, 4%, 5%, 6% even, you would start by finding 10% and multiplying, or 1% and multiplying. So I'm going to do some examples of each of these with you over the next couple of slides. Some are easier than others depending on the numbers I've chosen for you to divide by. So let's start off with 75%. So 75, change my table here a wee bit. So 75% is your 3/4. So we're going to find 3/4 of 24. So we're going to do 24, divide by 4 and times by 3, which is 6 times 3, which is 18. Now you may prefer to set it out by saying, well, I know that 25% is 6, so 75% is 3 times 6, which is 18. So kind of two different ways of laying it out. It's entirely up to you how you do it. 66 and 2/3 is 2/3 of 150. So we are going to do 150 divided by 3 times by 2. Now 150 divided by 3 is 50. If you don't know that, we can hide a 0 and just treat it as 15. And then 50 times 2 is 100. Alternatively, again, you could write down 33 and 1/3 is 50. So 66 and 2/3 is 100. So there's the first two done. Let's have a look next. Right, a wee 5%. So 5% is dividing by 20. I don't know about you, but 6 divided by 20 is a bit tricky. So for this one, we're going to write down what 10% is. 10% of 6 is dividing this by 10. Now, much easier to think of this in your head as 600 pence. 600 pence divided by 10 is clearly 60p. And then 5% is exactly half of your 10%. So half of 60p is 30p. So there's how to get your 5%. Alternatively, turning into 600p, dividing it by 20, cancel out your zeros, still gets you 30p, but I don't know if I prefer that way or not. I really like the 10% and half it. Then I've got my 12.5% one. So if you can go, oh, that is 1/8. And that works brilliant if you remember it's an eighth and it's a number that divides nicely by 8. I can clearly see that 16 divided by 8 is 2 with a 0, so it's 20 in this case. But let's look at the other method. You're going to half it, half it, half it. So start with 160, half of that, so basically 50% would be 80, 25%, half of that would be 40, and then 12.5% is half of that again, which is 20. This is a much easier method. But how often you ask 12.5%? Not a lot, but I like to include it. Okay, then we're going to go and do a 2%. So 2% is listed over here. We start by finding 1% here. So 1% is dividing by 100. This does not divide by 100 nicely because there are not two zeros. So we put a dot on the end, move it in 2 places, makes it £2.40. And then 2% would just be double of that answer, so double that gives you £4.80. Now, if I asked instead for 3%, I know I haven't, but in 3% you would do 3 times £2.40, which is £7.20, and you get the idea. You times by whatever digit you've got in front of the percent. Right, we're going to do 30%, so 30%, I always start by getting 10%. Again, I've chosen numbers with not dividing nicely by 10 here, so dividing by 10 gives me £3.20. And then 30% would be timesing that answer by 3, which is £9.60. Again, this would work for 40%, 60, 70, 80, 90%, and so on. Start by getting 10% and work from there. That's it. I've done one from each of the table. Here is more practice if you want them. I have got easy, medium, hard. The difference being the easy, you can easily knock off the zeros, or the 1 or the 2 zeros, easier numbers. The hard are a wee bit more challenging in the division and multiplication stakes. And then you've got answers if you want to pause and try them, or just look at the answers. There they are there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this has helped.